Niech będzie pochwalony Jezus Chrystus i Maryja Zawsze Dziewica. Dawid Nahajowski z Parlamentu Europejskiego w Brukseli. Serdecznie witam wszystkich Państwa. Dziś gościem w naszym studiu jest pan Nigel Farage, przewodniczący frakcji w Parlamencie Europejskim, która nosi nazwę Europa Wolności i Demokracji. Good morning, Mr. Farage. Thank you for your coming. First of all, I would like to ask, in your public placements, you often criticize the Brussels political elite. Who exactly do you mean by that?
Oh, the people that work for the European Commission, they're the big ones. I mean, we're here in the Parliament, and yes, there are 750 MEPs, but there are 30,000 people working for the European Commission. They, of course, represent the government of Europe. They're the people that make the laws. And what you've got to remember is this, that if you're a civil servant working in Britain or working in Poland, and you get a transfer to work for the European Commission, you are paid salaries that are beyond your wildest dreams. You have one of the best pension policies that's yet been seen by mankind in the history of time. You're living a very, very nice, very comfortable, very cosy life. And the one thing you want above all are for the institutions to get more power and to continue. And I'm afraid money dominates so many people. I've been here for 12 years. I've watched lots of people from Britain who've come here with healthily sceptical attitudes towards European integration, who within 2 or 3 years get bought by the system. Money is very good at doing that.
Who do you think rules the European Union right now? Who makes the main decision?
Well, it's certainly true that the heads of state, the Merkels and the Sarkozys, have had a much bigger say since 2008, since the financial crisis began. So when you watch your television screens, they're the big figures that you see, but working
Germany and France.
Yeah, Germany and France, very much so. And I mean, that's been the case ever since the start, and that hasn't changed. But quietly behind the scenes, the place where real power is built up steadily, piece by piece, is in the European Commission. And make no bones about it, the government of this Europe is the European Commission. It is unelected. It is therefore unremovable. And I mean, what kind of a system is that? I mean, we've had a parliamentary democracy in Britain for hundreds of years. You've had, since 1945, your nightmare period, and now 20 years of freedom, and now you're being governed by people that you can't vote for. That's not democracy.
Yeah. What should be the European Union approach to the relations with this kind of country like Egypt, Russia, the United States of America?
Well, that asks a very big question. Should the European Union have a foreign policy? If it's to have a foreign policy, how on earth are we all going to agree? I mean, there's almost no point in history where Britain and France have had similar approaches to foreign policy around the world. And at the moment, we have a European External Action Service that's been set up. It's got a big budget. The intention is it'll have 7,000 staff. It has a boss in Baroness Ashton. I suppose in some ways, I'm pleased to say that the European Union's voice at the moment on the world stage is being pretty much ignored. It lacks credibility, it lacks a boss, and anyway, there is this bigger question of how on earth are we all going to agree a common foreign policy? Very difficult indeed.
What about Mr. Barroso? What kind of policy is?
Well, Mr. Barroso, I mean, don't forget that Mr. Barroso was a communist as well. He was a Maoist. I mean, it's interesting when you look through these institutions at the number of people who were devotees of communism but have now happily adapted to this new, very lucrative way of life. Mr. Barroso, I've always had the impression, is a perfectly nice man as an individual, as a human being, but he is at the head, I think, of all that is wrong.
You don't like his policy?
Well, what I'm saying is I have no personal animosity towards him as a human being, but I think he is the boss of this new form of government.
Mr. Van Rompuy is the boss?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, who is the boss?
Who is the boss?
Well, the Lisbon Treaty has left this thing in such a mess. I've used the term in the European Parliament.
Who do I have to call to know about something European Union?
Well, this is what Mr. Kissinger asked many years ago, and the question's not been answered. If it's a foreign policy matter, is it Barroso, is it Ashton, is it Van Rompuy? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, they have set up a really very elaborate structure. But the one thing, of course, that Herman Van Rompuy has in common with Mr. Barroso is that he has not been elected and he cannot be removed. And the real power in these institutions is beyond the democratic fingertips of all of us. And that is, I think, the biggest problem that the EU has. And yet, when you talk to people inside these buildings, nobody actually wants to change that.
Independence is a word you often use in your speeches in the
Yeah.
European Parliament. As you know, Poles values their independence, which they regained not such a long time ago. So, do you believe that Poland could be a very independent country in this kind of Europe?
I completely understand your mentality of wanting to get as far away from Moscow as you possibly could. I totally understand that. But the difference is this. When you're in an organisation like NATO, you sit round a table as sovereign states and you agree to make deals or not to make deals. In the European Union, what you do is you give away the ability to make that decision to somebody else. And I think with countries like yours, it's extremely ironic that after enjoying this relatively short period of managing your own affairs, you now have the majority of your laws made by the institutions of the European Union. And my vision for Europe is a vision where countries like yours and mine govern themselves democratically by voting for their own governments that make their laws, and we then have the kind of Europe where we sit down together through the Council of Europe. Let's agree things. Let's have free trade between us. Let's do that. Let's agree some common minimum standards on the environment or working conditions. Perfectly happy to do that. Let's have a reciprocal deal on the number of students that want to go to your country or come to mine. Let's do all of those things, but let's do it as a Europe of sovereign democratic states, because what is really happening here is they're building a new country called Europe. And of course it's a country, it's got presidents and foreign ministers, and yet none of us have ever given consent to this. In fact, when the French were asked, did they approve of the European Constitution, they said no. When the Dutch were asked, they said no. And when the Irish said no, they were forced to vote again. There is no evidence that the people of Europe actually want this.
What do you think about the eurozone?
Well, I mean, I have been predicting since 1999, very loudly and very clearly here in the European Parliament, that the eurozone could not hold together and would not work. And I've been mocked and shouted at and abused for saying that.
Should the European Union accept the new member states despite the big economic crisis in Europe?
Well, I would suggest, and mercifully, my country is not part of the eurozone, thank goodness, but I would suggest that before the eurozone accepts any new members, it works out the problems that exist within it, and it is as plain as the nose on your face that Greece and Germany cannot work together in a single economic and monetary union. So the structure of the eurozone can't stay as it is. There are 2 or 3 countries that need to leave the eurozone for their own sakes. So to think of expanding a model that's already failing doesn't make much sense to me.
You were a member of the Conservative Party before. Now you prefer Euroscepticism. Why?
Well, I was a member of the Conservative Party, and I was a member of the party where Mrs. Thatcher was the Prime Minister in England, and when her approach to Europe was a very robust and healthy approach. I mean, she, of course, was as delighted as anybody to see the wall come down and to see countries like you regain their independence. She was very happy with all of that, but she was clear, Mrs. Thatcher, that for Britain, we wanted to be friendly with our European neighbours, but to pursue our global.
Was she a good Prime Minister?
Oh, I think she was a very good Prime Minister. When she left, I saw the Conservative Party beginning to line Britain up to join the euro. I saw the Conservative Party signing the Maastricht Treaty, and now I sit in the European Parliament and I watch my Conservative colleagues from Britain, and with a couple of exceptions, they vote for more European legislation week after week after week, and I feel truly liberated not being part of a party that I think has turned its back on its core values.
We hear a lot of criticism about the European Union. Do you think this institution has any advantages?
You could argue that some of the laws they'd made were good, sensible laws. So you could say this directive on cleaner seas, for argument's sake, was a sensible piece of law that really should have happened. Equally, you could say this piece of legislation is disastrous, you know, the common fisheries policy or whatever we want to talk about. But that isn't the point. You know, the point is this, that every single law that this place makes is drafted in secret, proposed by an unelected bureaucrat, and that they are the only people who have the ability to change or reform or amend that legislation in years to come. I don't see anything that's been done here that could not have been done by sovereign states cooperating together. And so what we have are tens of thousands of people employed at massive expense to the public purse, and all of us losing our democracies. So no, I don't support the structure at all. I don't believe we can reform it. I think it's way beyond reform. I think we have to start again with a vision of a fresh Europe.
What, in your opinion, will be the European Union in 50 years?
Well, if the European Union survives, it will be the least democratic, big area, probably on the earth, because by then perhaps even China will have changed. It will be low growth, high unemployment. We will have problems, I think, social problems coming in terms of attitudes towards migration into Europe. I mean, look, if this goes on as it is, it'll be a disaster. You cannot build a United States of Europe without the consent of the people. We haven't given that consent.
Thank you for your answers, Mr. Farage. Thank you very much for your coming. Drodzy Państwo, gościem naszym w studiu był pan Nigel Farage, przewodniczący frakcji Europa Wolności i Demokracji w Parlamencie Europejskim. Dziękuję Państwu za uwagę. Niech będzie pochwalony Jezus Chrystus i Maryja Zawsze Dziewica.